Now, we're going to talk about Moses. You know that because if you were here this morning, I wasn't. I was next door. But you were here. If you were here, you know you were talking about Moses and the burning bush. Whoosh. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, context for this, because context is everything. Number one, of course, Moses. His life can actually be divided up into about 4 chunks. So chunk number 1, he was a baby. And he got plonked in a basket quite carefully by his mother in the Nile, and probably he was up to, well, Ken said last week, up to 5 years old. He was quite an old baby in the basket. I'm not quite sure where a baby becomes an infant, becomes an adult. Our son became an adult at 6 when he announced there was no more parenting required, and that was it. Whatever happened to him, I have no idea. Anyway, actually, he's in the basket. He gets picked up, doesn't he, by Pharaoh's daughter. And from the age of 4, 5, right up to the age of 40, he's living in the palace. Which sounds quite a good idea in some ways, doesn't it? Living in the palace as the prince, as Pharaoh's adopted grandson. And Ken last week talked about him as a child of destiny. He had a real purpose, because that's what we're going to be thinking about, is God's purpose for Moses, and I hope also for us in terms of our purpose. So that was chunk number 1 for Moses. And interesting enough, he was in the palace between the ages of 13 and 23. Why does that matter? Well, if you think back to the age of 13 or 23, or for 3 people, if you think forward to the age of 13 or 23, it's a great time in your life. It's actually a very influential time in your life. It's the time where your tastes are shaped, where your opinions are informed. You can work out how old someone is by asking them what records they really liked. And unless they had an older brother or sister and they say, actually, I really love Matt Monroe, and you go, really? Actually, the truth is you can usually work it out. So you can work out how old I am, 13 to 23, because the first music that I really, really loved was disco music. I really wanted to go and see Saturday Night Fever, but it was an X, so you weren't allowed to go. An X is what they now call an 18 for younger people like Lizzie. And actually, I loved all that stuff because it just caught me in the moment. So you can imagine, couldn't you, with Moses, he was in the palace at a really influential time. A really, really influential time. So his culture, his taste, his music, it probably wasn't the Bee Gees in Moses' day, but his whole outlook would have been shaped by being in the palace. But of course, the key thing to remember with Moses was he never lost sense of his true identity. That's what I wrote down last week from Ken's talk. I thought that was a good point. So if you remember nothing else, remember Ken's talk from last week, because it was very good. And actually, it was this point that he never lost touch with his true identity. I think it's true, isn't it, for us? If we're going to be effective, we need to know who we are. And of course, we can claim we've got lots and lots of different identities. I look around this room. People come from different parts of the world. But we have one identity that matters. Only one. And that is that we are children of God. That we're children of God. The rest are all of a lower order. We're children of God. So Moses, you're asking, when are we going to get to the Bible reading? Oh, in about 10 minutes, don't worry. Actually, chunk number 1, Moses in the palace. That gets him to about 40 years old. Most people in this room are still kind of a bit above that. Me only just, but everyone else a bit ahead of it. No, it doesn't work, does it? If you like the Bee Gees in 1977, it just doesn't fit. So age 40, of course, Moses killed an Egyptian. And in effect, there was a manhunt. Pharaoh wanted to kill Moses. And Moses fled to Midian. And of course, his life completely changed. That's what we read about last week in chapter 2. His life completely changed. He went from being a prince to being a shepherd. Personally, I think that sounds like quite a good idea. But I guess it's a bit of a culture shock, isn't it? Definitely a bit of a culture shock. And he had a long, long period in the wilderness. I don't know about you, but whenever I look at the weekend papers, because I'm old enough to buy newspapers, because I still do that. Young people don't do that sort of thing, do they, David? But actually, when I look at the papers, I go, oh no, not another story about some person living in the suburbs of London who's bought a croft and is now learning about livestock for the first time. And you go, oh, there was a huge one in the Telegraph yesterday. Huge one. Lovely pictures of Highland cattle. But, I just didn't read the words, just looked at the pictures of the cattle, because there are so many of these, oh, we've had such a great life in the suburbs, but now we're moving to the Highlands. Give them 2 years, they'll all be gone. Anyway, bottom line is, big lifestyle change for Moses, really big one. And you can imagine that magazine profile in the Egyptian Times, can't you? Prince of the Wilderness, how Pharaoh's adopted grandson turned away from the glamour of life in the Egyptian court. Except he didn't really have a choice. He didn't have a choice because he had to flee, because he'd killed someone. And killing people is not a great idea. It really isn't. In this week's of all weeks, we know it's not a great idea. So Moses was fleeing, but he never lost his sense of identity. And he understood that he had a purpose. He wasn't quite sure what it was being. He was downsized, but God was shaping him. God was really shaping him. And of course, he was a shepherd. And I really was struck by this as Ken was talking last week. That, when we think about Moses as a shepherd, we think about Jesus as a shepherd. We think about the power of a shepherd. It goes right through the Bible. The power of a shepherd. So we're moving into chunk 3 of Moses' life, and he's 80 years old. Now, imagine being 80 years old and moving into a new phase in your life. Isn't that exciting? Isn't it really exciting? Because it means however old you are, there could still be great big things to come. And for Moses, that meant the biggest challenge of his life. He was going to have to be a leader. At that point at which people are retiring, some people retire much earlier. Our cleaner at work, she retired this week and she was 76. I said, I think it's time to retire. I said, well, my mum retired at 80. And actually, you never know, at whatever age you are, when God is going to use you in a truly amazing way. You might be 5 years old, or you might be 80. Don't you think we should read Exodus chapter 3? I think we probably should. I can see Ken going, for goodness sake, Andrew, get to the text. It's Exodus chapter 3. Now, the thing is, of course, it's not on the screen. Last week I was putting the words up. It was great. I was following along. I looked across, and what was really good was everyone was looking down at their Bibles. Or if you're a young person, David, at your telephone, which I still think is designed for making phone calls, but of course it clearly isn't. So actually, let's get to Exodus chapter 3. It's the burning bush story. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses, through the bush, thought the bush was on fire. It didn't burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush doesn't burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses! And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it's I who have sent you. When you've brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what's his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. Go, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I've watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt, into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go up to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed towards this people, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. For every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, so that you will plunder the Egyptians. So, there was Moses, just out tending the sheep. And it's tempting, isn't it, in our lives to forget that we need to listen for his call. We need to keep listening for his call. Sometimes God asks us to do quite ordinary things. We can't all be superheroes in one sense, in a sense that everybody knows some spectacular thing. But we can all be superheroes when we're doing God's work, whatever that is. Sometimes that is relatively ordinary. We use our talents. God gives us talents, and we use them as best we can to grow his kingdom. Because God has a real purpose for each of us. A real purpose. I'm looking at Megan. I'm thinking about mainly music and thinking, this is incredible. It's just brilliant. Rather you than me, I would rather do anything than do mainly music. But that's not my purpose. But God has given you that purpose. And it's brilliant. And it's being blessed in a wonderful way. A truly wonderful way. God has a purpose for all of us. But sometimes he asks people to do something which we would consider to be much, much bigger. Something that bigger than we could even imagine. What might have been an ordinary day, just tending sheep on behalf of his father-in-law. Woe betide you if you lost a sheep when you're working for your father-in-law. But what would have happened? Well, it changed him, didn't it? And it changed the course of history. It changed the Israelite people forever, because God was delivering on his promise, on the promise he'd set out. And it all happened because Moses heard the call. He heard the specific call. It's hot, 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 hot in the Middle East. Pretty hot. And things burn in the heat. They really do. You light something and wow, it burns away. But this bush, well, it just wouldn't disappear. Could you imagine this bush just wouldn't disappear? It just kept burning. You know, like some sparkler that went on forever. Incredible. And this was in a special place, in a place called Horeb, which could be the name for Mount Sinai, or it could be another mountain, but it was a very special place. And actually, Moses had been directed to be there, because that was all part of God's plan. And critically, as we read in verse 4, Moses was curious and alert. He was looking around. Now, one of the things I love about dogs is the way they sniff. So you know how dogs are... And if you're walking down any place with a dog with a big nose, it's all... Now, we don't really want to think about what they're sniffing about. Just bear in mind that a dog has 14 times the sniffing power that we do. So 14 times more sniffing than we can do. And actually, they are on the alert the whole time looking for smells. That's what they do. Dogs are great sniffers because they're alert. How alert are we? Not in sniffing the ground, but looking around and waiting for God to speak to us. Imagine what would have happened if Moses hadn't noticed the burning bush. Imagine if he'd had his iPhone and his iPads and his iPods and gone, you know, good worship song here, that's fine, and hadn't noticed, never saw the bush burning. Imagine that. Imagine if he was so self-consumed or so concerned with his own life that he didn't look and see what was around him, that he wasn't alert. Amazingly, of course, what did he see? He saw God in the bush. That must have been pretty spectacular. Imagine that. God in the bush. That would have been stunning. But it wouldn't have happened had he not been looking around, had a panoptic view. He had a panoptic view because God had a very particular plan for Moses. And all through the Bible, there are these people, these very particular people that God gives these plans to, very specific ones. The plan, of course, was his people, the Israelites, were stuck. They were stuck in Egypt. They were slaves. They had a pretty grim life. But God was not going to wipe them out. He was going to take them to a promised land. Just like God will never wipe out the Christians in this world now. There is a promise ahead for all of us. And amazing things can happen through amazing people. Sometimes through ordinary people. But are we listening? Are we alert? Are we ready for those incredible moments? Because throughout history, God has used people in incredible ways to do extraordinary things. Thing is, God knows each of us by name. Isn't that amazing? And he calls out, doesn't he? Moses, Moses. What if he calls out our name? What would happen? Would we be able to respond? How would we respond? Because God knows each of us, every single one of us, by name. And it's not one of those kind of fake showbiz friendships where you go up to the person. I'm not sure that we do this in a post-COVID world, all that sort of air kissing. Maybe air kissing is back in fashion now because, air kissing, head's in there somewhere. Maybe that's just Caroline and I. Anyway, bottom line is, air kissing, maybe it's a new COVID form of kissing. But, you go to certain occasions, and I'm sure you all have the same experience, where you meet people and everybody's hugging everybody else, and it's, certain environments, it's very, very huggy. I quite like it, to be honest with you. I don't mind it at all, I'm always a little embarrassed when everybody hugs everyone else, and I go up for my hug, and everyone walks in the other direction, but that's another matter. But actually, the truth is, we have a great and close and familiar relationship with God, which is wonderful, because he knows us by name. But there is a risk. The risk is we diminish him. Actually, we need never to lose the sense of awe that is God. The real sense of awe that is the Almighty God. The Almighty God. We live in a very casual world, don't we? When we were growing up, and I'm sure it's the same for many people in this room, our parents' friends were always called auntie and uncle. Do you remember that? Now, it won't be the same in new generations because that's kind of gone. It was always a bit confusing because you wondered, well, who's my real aunt and who isn't? You know, who are these aunties and uncles? Doesn't look anything like me, doesn't speak like me, where have they come from? But that was the way we did it. Thankfully, those days have gone. But actually, it's a very different casual world. Equally, last night we were watching The Queen on TV. Actually, it's on Netflix, because we knew our son, William, was doing something else. So we logged onto his account and we watched The Queen on Netflix. And the truth is, I've not seen that one. That's the one that's set the week after Princess Diana dies. And there are all kinds of issues about protocol and how the royal family managed it, and the extent to which society had moved on and was much more emotional. And the Queen, who was of a particular generation, was very different. But when you meet the Queen, you don't say, "Hi Lizzie, how are you doing today?" It just doesn't work. Bear that in mind, Freya, when you meet the Queen. That is how it doesn't work. It isn't. There are protocols. There are very specific protocols. Did you know, for example, that when you meet the Queen, you can't turn your back on her? So what you have to do is, I'm just giving you some advice here, should you ever go to meet the Queen in a... You start by saying, "Your Majesty." And then after that it's "Ma'am." And then at the end you go, "Your Majesty." And then you're not allowed to go, "See you later," and do that. You have to basically walk backwards, kind of like this. Try and avoid doing a sort of Michael Jackson moon dance in the process. But yes, that's what you have to do, because there are protocols. And actually, we need to make sure that the relationship we have with God and through his son Jesus, which is close and intimate, doesn't lose a sense of awe, doesn't diminish the greatness of God. Moses responded to God's call because, remember, God said, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Well, here I am." Yeah, here I am. But what did God do? He stopped him in his tracks. He completely stopped him in his tracks. He said, "Halt. Don't come any closer. Don't come any closer. In fact, take off your sandals, because you're now in the presence of the Lord." The presence of the Lord is something we're all going to face one day. And actually, the power of the Lord, I think, would have been quite overwhelming to Moses. It would have just felt so incredible. The ground became holy ground because God was there, really, really strongly there. Now I believe, and I know we all share, that God is with us here as well. We might not have a bush burning, but we have a presence of God wherever his believers meet. He hears what we're saying through the power of his Spirit that comes down upon us. In this case, it was a very personal and powerful experience that Moses had. And verse 6, just in case, with God here speaking to Moses, just in case he was in any doubt, God tells him that actually he is God and he's been around forever. Now, we say that about people. We say, Carol's been around forever. But actually, we're talking here about God. Now, God really has been around forever. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob." This is real and accurate history. That's why the Old Testament matters, because it's accurate history, not the kind of selective interpretation which we see. We see it this week from the president of Russia choosing to apply things in certain ways. This is true, accurate history. Now, it's hardly surprising, isn't it, when God speaks to you from a bush, that once you've been stopped in your tracks, you hide your face. Because I think he'd just been confronted by the sheer power of God. Just the sheer power. Now, in a previous life, in my BBC days, I was always struck by the number of people who said, Oh, have you met many famous people? Do you know many famous people? I'd always just say Caroline Jones. She's the only one I know who's a famous person. Actually, people always were, I think, kind of intoxicated by fame. I was intoxicated by the TV series Fame, but that's another story. Do you remember that? Fame, I want to live forever. Another story, another era. It's in that magic era, 13 to 23. Anyway, loved Laurie Singer. Bottom line is, actually, people are intoxicated by shallow fame. Here today, gone tomorrow. But Moses wasn't looking at someone who was a star for a day. He was talking about the Creator God. He was talking about someone who is here today, was here yesterday, and will be here tomorrow. And when we find ourselves in the presence of the Lord, it's something quite different. And the truth is, that's the only celebrity I'd ever want to meet, is the Lord. Forget the rest. There's only one famous person that we all want to meet. That's the Lord. What's more, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. But interesting enough, isn't it? Despite this incredible experience, Moses was still in a situation where he was suffering a bit from kind of imposter syndrome. Do you know what imposter syndrome is? It's that sense that you don't actually feel you're capable of doing the job. So you move into a particular role, or somebody says to you, do something, and you think, I don't think I can do that. Well, you can understand why Moses felt a bit like that. And what did he say in verse 11? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? Bear in mind, Pharaoh had been his, to all intents and purposes, grandfather, and bring the Israelites out of Egypt. But that was the job that God had asked him to do. That was his purpose. What did God say in verse 12? He said, I will be with you. I will be with you. How important is it us to remember in everything that we do that I will be with you. The Lord will be with you. But Moses is still a bit worried. By the time we get to verse 13, he's still worried about how he's going to motivate these people. Because they're a bit jaded. They're a bit skeptical. They're kind of semi-believers. We look around the place and we see so many people who look a bit jaded, a bit skeptical, semi-detached from whatever Christian understanding they ever had. What did God say to Moses? Moses said, well, what am I going to tell them? What did I say he spoke to? What does he say? He says, I am who I am. This is the eternal God. The I am God. He is self-existent. He's eternal and unchangeable. And that's really hard, isn't it? Because we're looking at the clock going, tomorrow's this day, and then we're only 2 days of time, and it'll be March. It'll be March on Tuesday. And we're thinking about things in a very kind of linear fashion. But God is eternal. And that's something which it kind of blows our minds. It's so difficult for us to understand. But he is eternal and unchangeable. And if we're any doubt at all about Jesus, fully God and fully man, let's think how Jesus described himself as well. So let's have a quick flick into John's Gospel, chapter 8. John's Gospel, chapter 8, and at verse 54. So Jesus is getting a huge amount of criticism about who he was. He was being told he wasn't old enough. He was being told that actually he was some kind of heretic. And what did Jesus say in verse 58? I tell you the truth, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, at this they picked up the stones and threw him. And what did he say? I am. Before Abraham was born, I am. They didn't like it. That's why they threw the stones at him. And Jesus had to slip away. Jesus said, I am. God said to Moses, I am. So our question is, are we too casual in our relationship with God? Are we too willing to diminish his power? Actually, not to see the awe? Are we too willing to not really understand his status and to lose the fact that God can do what he likes, when he likes, whenever he likes? The I am God. We need to be alert. We need to be looking around, listening for his call. But we mustn't lose sight of the awe, of the power, of the intensity of our God, the Almighty God, because he is the real deal and he can do anything he wants at any time. And he might just be asking us to carry out a very specific task, just like he asked Moses. Talk to Ken and V about the living rooms and the way that God asked them to carry out that, gave them that sense of purpose. And there are other people in this room who have similar testimonies of things that God has given them to do. But we need to be listening. And we don't diminish God, but we look for big things to happen. Because actually, the other thing about God is he is the big strategic planner. Now, you know I talk about our household, and I'll often say, you've heard me say it before, well, Caroline does the practical stuff and I do the strategic planning. Which means I basically sit with a copy of the Daily Telegraph, a mug of coffee, and say to Caroline, right, what's the next job you've got to do? Not true. I say, would you like a coffee before you start the next job? God is all-seeing, all-knowing. And he sees things. He said in verse 7, he has seen the way in which his people are being oppressed. He's heard their cries. At a time like this, when we look around and we're all concerned about what's happening in Europe, God hears us. He really does. And he said in verse 8 to Moses, all you've got to do is to bring the Israelites out of Egypt and start by telling the people and also mention it to Pharaoh. That's all you've got to do. And by verse 11, it's not surprising really, is it, that Moses had his doubts. People, as we've talked about, were worn down, and Pharaoh was, unlikely to be supportive. But God is the strategic planner. God is in charge. He sees the big picture. I was thinking about this week, and obviously Ken has talked a lot about it already, and it's in our minds. And I just was very drawn by going to Matthew's Gospel. And verse 24. So let's just have a quick look at Matthew's Gospel and just let's pick up at verse 24. This is in the context of talking about the end of the age. 24, Caroline, chapter 24. Oh, I was so excited about the verse. 24. It's a long gospel. Anyway, it's in the section which is the signs of the end of the age. And actually, this will be very familiar to us. Jesus said in verse 4, watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Now, this is the context towards the end of the age. And that's a whole separate talk. But the point here is that we shouldn't be alarmed. God knows what's going to happen. We're in his hands. And the sad reality is that terrible things do happen. It's not easy for us as Christians to admit that, but terrible things do happen. But God never breaks a promise. God had made a promise to the Israelites that they would be taken to the promised land. It was a long process. But he never breaks a promise. That's what it said in verse 17 of Exodus. I have promised to bring you up. God's promises are better, stronger, more powerful, longer lasting than any other promise you make, because they're promises from God, and God never breaks a promise. And what's more, he knows what's going to happen. We don't. We don't know what we're going to wake up to tomorrow morning, but God knows. God knows what's going to happen today, tomorrow, and in the future. He said, didn't he, in verse 18 when he was talking to Moses, the elders will listen to you, or the elders are going to be listening to you. That's great. But Pharaoh, Pharaoh's going to be hard-hearted. And as we go through the book of Exodus, there are some amazing things that happen before Pharaoh's heart finally melts. Sometimes it's the case, isn't it, that difficult leaders, that's a polite way of putting it, are hard-hearted. As we've already prayed, it's so important that we pray for the heart of Vladimir Putin to be softened. It's really important that leaders' hearts will be softened. Now, in the context of the Exodus, of course, we know in verse 20, God said to Moses that Pharaoh would let them go because he's going to be compelled by what? A mighty hand. A mighty hand. Occasionally you meet people, in the days when we used to shake hands with people, pre-COVID, before the COVID, what used to happen? We used to shake, when we weren't hugging them and air kissing them, we used to shake hands with them. Hello. And occasionally you'd sort of meet someone and they'd have a hand, the size of a shovel. And you go, that's a big hand. What a whopper. And I always tried to restrain from going, you've got a whopper, because it could be misconstrued. But actually, the truth is that some people have massive hands. But no one has a hand the size of God. A mighty hand. And we need to remember that, especially at the moment. We need to remember that it's God's mighty hand that can do incredible things. Pharaoh wasn't giving up easily, was he? He wasn't going to do it. But no one has a bigger hand than God. And so it leads to the long trek to the promised land. Moses didn't make it, but he did fulfill God's purpose by being alert and responding to his call. You might have thought God's idea was crazy. Wow, I can't do this. But he treated him with reverence, and he understood the power and the awe of God, of the I am God. The God who, when he says, I want you to do this, will make it happen. And he remembered that God is in charge. God is the strategic planner. God knows what happened yesterday and what's going to happen tomorrow. So Moses was 80. Wow. And whatever age we are, whether we're very young or middle-aged or older, we need to remain alert to God's call. We need to think about what is it that the awesome God may be asking us to do. What is it? And when we hear of wars, when we hear of terrible things going on, let's not panic. Let's not panic. But let's hold on to our identity as children of God. We're children of God. God will rescue us just as he rescued the Israelites. He will rescue us because we are his children. So let's trust in the Lord. Let's be ready for his call. Let's be alert to things around us. But let's not forget that we are children of God. Shall we stop there? I think we will.